From Penn State Health and Penn State College of Medicine, this is Ask Us Anything About the Ethics of Genomic Research. I'm Scott Gilbert. Well, historically, medical treatments have been based on research studying broad groups of people, but the thinking has evolved as we now realize that due to our genetics and our biology, treatments that work best for one person may not work that well for another. Enter the study of genetics and genomics. And here to explain the difference and to talk about this subject in some more depth today is Dr. Jennifer McCormick. She's an associate professor of humanities and a research ethics and policy expert here at Penn State College of Medicine. Dr. McCormick, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you.
I made a reference in the introduction there to both genetics and genomics, and there might be people thinking, aren't they the same thing? Could you kind of briefly explain the difference for us?
Sure. So when we think about genetics, we're really thinking about studying an individual gene or just a few genes. And then when we're thinking about genomics, we're thinking about the entire genome. Or sometimes it's used to refer to large chunks of genome. We've really been doing genetic research for quite some time, studying individual genes, their sequence, what they do, what diseases they might cause. But genomics has really kind of taken on because of our ability to sequence large amounts of DNA and capture it and do some sequencing analysis fairly quickly.
So it involves taking a much broader look at somebody's makeup.
Exactly. And in principle, we can look at all the genes, the entire sequence of anyone's genome. That's what whole genome sequencing refers to.
So then why is this, first of all, for you as a researcher and ethicist, why is this exciting?
So let's kind of take that question in two parts. So as a biologist or a biomedical research scientist, it's really exciting because we're really able to kind of look at some of the fundamental molecules that help tell our body and what to do and how to create different proteins and other molecules in our body. So we're basically looking at the code that makes us who we are. If we're sequencing another organism, we're looking at that organism's code. And so it just opens up a whole new set of pathways for studying gene interactions with the environment, associations with diseases, and like I said, just really kind of understanding what it means, how we get to be who we are. From an ethics point of view, so wearing my ethicist hat, it's exciting, but it's a little daunting, and there's some things in there that raise people like myself. We get concerned. I have a mentor who likes to say we're professional worrywarts when it comes to genomics. And so because there's so much information coming out and we're pushing forward into a new domain of science, there are all sorts of different ethical challenges that come up that I think we'll be talking about later, but like privacy, confidentiality, sure, discrimination, who has access to data, return of results, all sorts of different things.
So the bottom line is this information can be used among other ways to determine, I guess, who is most susceptible to a disease. Maybe I'm more susceptible to something than you are, but also how the disease may be treated in me versus you, and a bunch of other factors, right?
Exactly. And so, there's a lot about disease we can understand, but kind of just going back, there's a lot about normal function that we can understand too. So in both ways, it's very exciting.
You're watching Ask Us Anything About the Ethics of Genomic Research. This is Dr. Jennifer McCormick. She's an associate professor of humanities, also a research ethics and policy expert here at Penn State College of Medicine. We welcome your questions for Dr. McCormick. Just add them to the comment field below this Facebook post. Whether you're watching this Facebook post live, this video live, or if you're watching it on playback, we'll track down some answers for you. Let's talk a little bit about biobanking. It's also referred to maybe as a biorepository. One example of that is right here on this campus, the Penn State Institute for Personalized Medicine. And there are obviously many people who have already become a part of that by donating samples. And can you talk about that process and kind of what it involves for any biobank really in terms of what is asked of patients, or what I should say, what is asked of subjects to get involved?
Sure. So in terms of biobanking, basically you're creating I like to think of it as a piece of research infrastructure. It's not really designed for a specific study usually, but we're creating what researchers are doing and institutions are doing is that they're collecting large amounts of biospecimens or samples so that they can extract the DNA and study the DNA. But they're also asking anyone who participates in a biobank, they're also asking that individual to allow the researchers to have access to their medical information. So there's, of course, all of this is de-identified when it's used, so no one knows whose DNA and whose medical records are being used, except for the person who runs the biobank, the honest broker. And then sometimes some biobanks actually collect lifestyle information, so questionnaires. So you have a whole set of different types of data. You have DNA data, you have medical record data, and then you have lifestyle and behavioral data. And so whenever a researcher might have a question about a certain disease, wanting to say, well, is this type of person, is there, if they have this in their medical record, this particular disease that they've been diagnosed, can we go and look at their genome, their DNA, part of their DNA, and see what the particular sequence is of that DNA. So basically what a biobank is doing is it's allowing researchers to do a lot of studies more quickly without having to go out and recruit individual participants.
Well, let's talk about the process of when you talk about de-identification. I think that's an important thing for people to realize, because basically people are viewed as a whole person. You're seeing their medical history, you're seeing their entire genomic makeup. However, we don't know who that person is, and that's by design.
Exactly. So when a person is participating in a biobank, when they decide to do that, there's a typical informed consent process they go through, and they're talking to someone associated with the biobank so that they can ask questions. But what they're essentially doing is they're saying, I really trust you to use my information wisely and to be a good steward of that information. Because when you contribute to a biobank, you really have no idea and you have no say in what type of studies those your data are going to be used in. And your data can last a long time, so it's going to be used in theory forever. Unless you retract your consent, obviously. So the de-identification process is basically your data. So if I were in a biobank, my biospecimens and my medical record data and any lifestyle and behavioral question answers that I've responded to, all of those would be linked to a unique code. And then that code would be matched to my name. My name would then be removed from all the data. My social security number, my medical record number would also be removed from that data. So the code and those particular unique identifiers are over here in a particular database. And then all my data linked to that code are in another database. And this database where my data are linked to the unique code, that is what researchers are using. And then what we call the honest broker, the trusted person, usually one or two people who are running the biobank, they're the only people that have access to that code. And of course, all these data are kept behind secure firewalls. So here at Penn State, all the data are behind the same firewalls and we take the same precautions to protect them that we would with medical record data that's housed in any of the medical centers, Hershey Medical Center's databases.
And that's so important because we're hearing some, in a broader sense, the Equifax situation and some other privacy breaches out there. That might put some people's minds at ease to know the kind of care that goes into protecting their personal information, their medical information.
Exactly. I mean, I think one of the things, of course, any institution can't guarantee there'll never be any breaches. But when people are contributing to a biobank at an academic institution, a medical academic institution, the people who are collecting that and storing that really value the trust that people put into us. And so we do what we can to be as trustworthy as we can.
You're watching Ask Us Anything about the ethics of genomic research. This is Dr. Jennifer McCormick. She's an associate professor of humanities, also research ethics and policy expert here at Penn State College of Medicine. We welcome your questions and your comments. Just add them to the comment field, and we'll make sure we pose those questions here to Dr. McCormick. Very simply, I guess, then, what is the incentive? Why would someone want to be part of a biobank? I guess one reason could be you have the potential to do a lot of good for the future.
Really, that is the major incentive that someone would have to participate in a biobank. It's really being altruistic and wanting to contribute to future research and trusting the institution to which you're giving your sample and information for research. Now, in some instances, very rare, but in some instances, let's actually back up a step. Some of the biobanks are disease-focused. So some are actually population-based, so they collect healthy and sick people samples and data, but others are really very focused on a particular disease, like pancreatic cancer, for example. And in that case, people may be very incentivized to contribute to that because they have a loved one or a friend, or they know someone who has died from pancreatic cancer or who has pancreatic cancer. So their incentive may be twofold, just kind of pure altruistic to contribute to science and future research, but then also, because they really want to do something to help promote understanding pancreatic cancer.
Sure. That's a really good example. And when it comes to some of these ethical issues, let's dive into some of those. Sure. Because, for example, let's say that I'm part of one of these databases and there is an incidental finding about my genomic makeup. It may or may not even be related to, let's say I'm in a pancreatic cancer database for a study on pancreatic cancer, and let's say you find something else out about me. Let's say you happen to notice a gene that predisposes me to a totally separate disease. What kind of process is typically in place to determine whether that information should make its way back to the individual?
That's a really good question. So in a lot of instances, models have been set up, or what we call governance processes. So we start right back at the beginning of the consent process. When an individual is participating or deciding to participate in a biobank, they'll be typically informed in the consent document, not always, but usually, that they shouldn't expect anything in return in terms of an actual finding about themselves, but there may be the chance that something comes up that experts think might be clinically useful to that individual or that individual's family.
When you say clinically useful, what do you mean?
Well, that's another really good question. Clinically useful, depending on who you talk to, can be perceived in different ways. And in some of my own work, I've come to appreciate that the experts, so clinicians and geneticists, might view clinically useful, have a much narrower definition of what is clinically useful than someone who is, from the general public. A really good example of that is Alzheimer's disease. Is finding out your risk, whether you carry a particular mutation in the gene called APOE4, which increases a person's risk of Alzheimer's disease. Is that getting that information back? Is that finding useful? Medical experts would largely say, not really, because we can't do anything about
There's no cure.
Right, but many other people, and I've heard this from numerous people, would say, well, actually, I can plan for the future. I can change my lifestyle. I can do more mental exercises. So, again, it kind of depends on who you are. Typically, though, in the case of a biobank, because it's really the intent is research and discovery, the definition that is often used is a pretty narrow definition of what is clinically useful. But a really good example of that would be, going back to your question, is if in this pancreatic biorepository, if the investigator found that some of the participants, a small number, actually were carriers of a pathogenic variant or a mutation in what's called the BRCA gene, which sets a woman's increases a woman's risk significantly for breast and or ovarian cancer. So that's, that most experts would agree that that is clinically useful. And so typically, the investigator, the scientist would have that finding. They would take it to this group of experts that might contain clinicians, maybe even a lay person, other scientists, and they would kind of discuss and decide whether it should be returned. And in that case, biorepositories usually have a process set up, and in some instances, so the process would include reaching out to the individual, usually with just kind of a letter, informing them that that we found something, their samples have been used in a particular study, and that the investigators have found something that the individual might find useful, and if they want further information, they should contact this number. And if they reach out and make that contact, then the individual is set up usually with a genetic counselor to talk about the pros and cons of learning a genetic finding. And then if they decide to learn, go further, then they actually learn about that finding. Sometimes it's returned to the individual as purely a research finding, which means that the individual would then need to go on and get it clinically validated, so get it tested in a real clinical lab.
All important stuff to ask about up front, perhaps, when you become part of a biobank or biorepository. You're watching Ask Us Anything About the Ethics of Genomic Research from Penn State College of Medicine. I'm Scott Gilbert, alongside Dr. Jennifer McCormick. She is Associate Professor of Humanities, also a research ethics and policy expert, and we welcome your questions for Dr. McCormick. Another one of mine would involve who has access to that information. A lot of questions, because you talked about contacting the individual. Other considerations might be, should the individual's family members have access to the information, because no finding such as this affects, well, I guess few findings affect just that individual, because everyone's connected to a larger family unit. And then also enter issues such as insurers and employers. People may say, I don't want those people to know this information.
That is another really good question. So let's start with insurers and employers. There is a law in place called GINA. It stands for the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, and it is something that protects individuals from discrimination based on genetic information from health insurers and large employers. It does have some weaknesses, the law does, in that it doesn't protect individuals from just genetic discrimination by life insurers or disability insurers. So there are some protections in place, but again, there are some holes in that. And then institutions, we kind of talked about the steps that institutions take to protect that information. So that that in and of itself should bring some reassurance to individuals in terms of anyone coming in and getting it just because they want to, in terms of insurers. Family members is another really good question in terms of, so usually if the individual is alive, a researcher would not return a finding to a family member unless the individual gave that researcher permission to do so.
But it's true, let's say that the individual has passed away and that this finding could affect, let's say, the individual's children.
That is another really good question, and there are a group of researchers who are working on that. In fact, one of my former mentors with two other individuals did a large study that was funded by NIH, and they looked at this very question. They did empirical work, so they did a survey and did interviews, and then based on those data, they had a working group with other experts in genetics, genomics, and research and privacy and confidentiality, and they met over a series of, I think, at least 3 years, and they came up with a set of recommendations that were actually published in the peer review in a journal in 2015. So, now because of that, we have kind of recommendations as how to move forward. But for samples that were collected prior to that, it really is a good question. And basically what the experts suggest is that the investigator does not have an obligation to go out and hunt down those family members. If a family member should come to them and they want that information, and the participant before they died did not give permission to share with family members, then you follow the state law in terms of who's at the top of the next of kin hierarchy in terms of who can get the information. That would be similar to with medical information.
Very important questions to ask, though. And again, these are all things that if someone's going to participate in a biorepository or biobank, they could ask up front for some of the answers to these very important questions.
Exactly.
I guess another question I have is about how researchers and medical professionals go about right-sizing people's expectations, because we talked earlier about how much of the benefit in this type of research that results from genomic study, it's to benefit people in the future. And do some people approach it, though, wanting to be part of this kind of work, mistakenly thinking it's going to cure them of whatever they may have?
Yes, and that's not a problem isolated to just biobanking and genomic research, but indeed, I think it's really important to remember that while we have the full sequence of the genome, that was the goal of the Human Genome Project that really lasted throughout the 1990s, the full sequence being released in the early first part of the 2000s. We have that data, but there's a lot of that data that we do not understand what it means or know what it means in a biological context, let alone in a medical context. So I think we need to realize, scientists and the public and clinicians, that this is an exciting time and this is an exciting era to be working and doing things with genomics, but we have so much to learn, and we should not expect cures or significant changes to how we treat people for quite some time.
Because it's voluminous data that comes from a genome study, and we don't know what all that data means yet, do we?
Exactly. I mean, we are making incremental progress. I mean, you can go out and you can see different studies where we've come to understand a particular a mutation in a particular gene in a particular group of people, and we've figured out, well, wow, this is a new mutation, and this is associated with a disease that we didn't realize. So we're making incremental small steps, but anything huge is not going to happen for quite some time.
Dr. Jennifer McCormick, you're an associate professor of humanities, a research ethics and policy expert. There are some very impressive books in this office, which people can't see on camera right now. But as you would expect, there are a lot of humongous academic volumes. I need to show you one of them, though. This is really my speed. Genetics for Dummies actually exists. That's fantastic. So this might be a good resource for people to go to. And if there are any other resources that people can read about genetics and genomics, perhaps we can share those links below in the comment field below this Facebook post. But is there anything else you'd like to add as we wrap things up that you'd like people to know about?
Well, I think basically I would encourage people, if they're interested in participating in a biobank or a general genomic study, that they should, but they do have to realize that some of the different risks, and they should approach the study thinking, I'm doing this, or approach participating in the biobank, I'm doing this altruistically. I'm contributing to the progress of science, because really it's not just the scientists who make this happen, it's the people who participate. Really, they're just as critical as the scientists doing their work.
Yeah, because without those participants, there would be no repository.
Exactly.
Fantastic. Dr. Jennifer McCormick, thank you so much for your time today. It was great talking with you about this.
Thank you.
And we appreciate you watching Ask Us Anything About the Ethics of Genomic Research from Penn State Health and Penn State College of Medicine.